Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with the 5 greatest specialty record labels. Now, what is a specialty record label? It's a very good question because the definition is kind of nebulous. We like to think of the classical record industry as divided into 2 broad categories. The majors, the major labels, who we already talked about, they were CBS, RCA, and Deutsche Grammophon, Decca Phillips, and EMI HMV. Those were the big 5. And aside from those, everybody else was essentially an indie, an independent label, smaller, more specifically focused on certain, catalog things. But most importantly, they didn't have the big names signed to exclusive contracts. The major labels had wrapped up all of that. And so in order to be a viable record label, you had to specialize in repertoire, filling catalog niches that were interesting and that people, wanted to hear, but were not being exploited by the major labels. And that is a very interesting history all by itself. There are quite a few of them, and they were not yet the independent labels as we recognize them today. They really weren't. They had their model was the large labels shrunk down to size. The majors sort of shrunk down to size, but they aspired to majordom, and some of them actually made it. So here are 5 specialty record labels that existed in the 50s, 60s, 70s. That's where we are, and 80s. After the compact disc arrived and the digital revolution arrived, the whole business model for the record industry changed, and you had your majors who were declining, and the independent labels who were flourishing. For a variety of reasons, or they flourished. Well, yeah, they were. They flourished. They did awfully well. They made all kinds of recordings. But we'll get to that in the next video. For now, we're dealing with the specialty labels and the period around the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Number 1, Telefunken. Now, Telefunken was a German label, obviously. They had a rather boutique-y catalog of interesting things here and there. They had stuff like the Kyle Bruckner Sixth with the Berlin Philharmonic. They didn't have a huge catalog. They took the leftovers from Deutsche Grammophon and the other big German labels. Well, Deutsche Grammophon was the big German label, and however, what Telefunken started to do was specialize in early music and period performance practice. And the 2 artists they had to do that were Nicholas Harnoncourt and Gustav Leonhardt, who are today legendary, major, huge artists, enormous, big names. But they weren't then. They were really sidelines. And when they began doing their complete Bach cantata series, Telefunken blossomed into a major player eventually, which changed their name. They changed their name to Teldec, which was more international sounding. Now they're Warner. They're owned by Warner. But Telefunken began doing the Bach cantatas. Remember how beautiful those editions were? You got the sturdy brown box with basically 4 cantatas usually, one on each side of the LP. And each one had 2 LPs. And you got the complete score with the record. So you could follow along. I mean, it was a very serious scholarly project, and it put Telefunken, now Teldec, on the map. So they were really the model of a specialty label, doing something that everybody acknowledged was significant and important, but that the major labels weren't interested in doing, at least not to the same degree. Of course, Carl Richter was doing zillions of Bach cantatas for Archive, which was part of Deutsche Grammophon. But at the same time, they were following their period instrument things, and they amassed this enormous catalog, becoming eventually a major label. So Telefunken was, in the 60s and 70s and 80s mostly, a specialty label. Next, Mercury Living Presence. Mercury Living Presence was, of course, sucked up eventually by Universal, and particularly Philips. And the engineers at Mercury, Bob Fine and his wife Wilma Cozart, who was the manager of the label, were running around with their van and their 3-mic system doing recordings for major labels. They made the recordings, for example, for Philips of Richter doing the Liszt piano concertos. They did the Tchaikovsky serenades with Anatole Dorati when he moved to Philips. They did the Leonard Bernstein Maria Callas Cherubini Medea at La Scala. I mean, that was all Mercury. But basically, they had their own catalog and their own batch of artists. Anatole Dorati was their conductor of choice, but they also had Skrovatchevsky, and they had Paul Paré with the Detroit Symphony, and so they had a roster of artists who nowadays we think of as major artists, but who were second tier in the 60s when most of these recordings were issued, and they were known as a boutique audiophile label more than anything else. They also had a wonderful flock of pianists, including Byron Janis and folks like that. They had Gina Bachauer. They had some really, really cool artists on the label. But these were artists who were in the process of becoming something. They hadn't necessarily arrived. And as a result of that, nowadays, everybody's arrived. I mean, we think that these are legendary recordings, and so they are. But they are because of the catalog that Wilma Cozart Fine put together. She was the genius behind designing a boutique catalog under an audiophile rubric. And that also is a specialty label. Typically, specialty labels was, in a more modern sense, once we finally had digital recording and whatnot, Telarc. Telarc was an audiophile label from the very beginning. But Telarc was an audiophile label at a time when there were so many really first-rate ensembles around who weren't getting recorded that they were able to step into the breach. They were based in Cleveland. So they had the Cleveland Orchestra after Zell had gone. They had the Cleveland Orchestra with Mazel, with Christoph von Dohnanyi, and others. And they also got the Atlanta Symphony. They benefited from the fact that the second-tier orchestras were, at this point, so improved and so good that they could really withstand comparison to anything else that was out there. And they basically exploited the virtues. Some would not consider them all virtues, but the virtues of the compact disc and digital recording technology, but they did it very well. Telarc recordings always sounded splendid, whether they were on LP or CD. And it's interesting, actually, as a specialty label, that Telarc took a trick or two by getting Frederick Fennell to do the Holst band suites, which he had done for Mercury Living Presence, but in mono, because Mercury had Howard Hansen and the Eastman Rochester Orchestra, the Eastman Wind Ensemble, and Telarc took a lesson from those legendary fabled recordings and made some stunning recordings of their own, using the same artists. Well, not the Eastman Wind Ensemble, obviously, but it was the Cleveland Orchestra Winds, and the same conductor, Frederick Fennell, and some of the same repertoire. So that was a major example of what a specialty label was right at the transition between analog and digital recordings from LP to CD. And of course, now Telarc is owned by Concord Music, and nobody knows what's happening with its catalog. It's all vanished, or mostly vanished. Some of it's still available, but there's no word coming from any of these people as to what they're going to do with this magnificent catalog, which, because it was so smartly put together, is ideal for boxing up. They should just do all the Cleveland recordings, all the Atlanta recordings, all their quartet recordings. They had the Cleveland Quartet. They had, they could do a beautiful, beautiful series if they wanted to. They also had Slatkin in St. Louis doing some things. It was really a splendid label and a logical label, one that had real focus. And that was what, made it a successful specialty label. Another very successful specialty label, which is currently dwelling somewhere in the nether regions, was Nonesuch. Nonesuch was the brainchild of a guy named Bob Hurwitz, no relation, and he specialized in contemporary repertoire and certain artists who were not having the biggest concert careers in the universe, but who were really supreme musicians. Like Richard Good, for example. I mean, he's, the classic case in point, Mieczysław Horszowski, in his last 3 or 4 recordings. Nonesuch also licensed a lot of content. They had, Leslie Jones and the Little Orchestra of London, or whatever that was, doing like Haydn symphonies. They had the original Masterpiece Theater disc, the Moray Fanfares for the King's Supper. They had French Baroque music. They had early Günter von recordings with the Gurzenich Orchestra. They had all kinds of stuff. But they especially had fabulous new recordings of contemporary music. They had Arthur Weisberg with a contemporary music ensemble doing court violin B.O. They had George Crumb with Jan de Gaetani. They had really, really first-class performances of contemporary music. And all of that, this wonderful, wonderful catalog, has sort of vanished also. They had Gerard Schwartz with the Los Angeles Chamber Orchestra. And interesting repertoire selections. It was a connoisseur's label, granted, but a successful one. And all of that stuff is still just, sitting around somewhere. It's really a shame. They had Jacob's Debussy recordings. They had, the list can go on and on and on. And a lot of these are recordings now that are highly, highly admired. They really are. But at the time, once again, they were lesser-known artists, and a lot of the repertoire was as good as unknown. Now some of it is highly respected, and it's become a classic. But back then, it was daring. And after Nonesuch, the other label, contemporary music label, was ECM, which stands for Edition of Contemporary Music. It was founded in 1969 by Manfred Eicher in Germany, and they did all kinds of interesting things. Tons of contemporary music. Arvo Pärt was their big, big discovery that everyone went crazy over once minimalism happened, and Steve Reich was another one. And Steve Reich was also on Nonesuch. A big edition of his stuff on Nonesuch. The minimalists were an important addition to the Nonesuch and ECM catalogs. They had Keith Jarrett playing Bach and Shostakovich and C.P.E. Bach and things like that. This sort of crossover between jazz and classical, and the cusp of that, or sort of very high-end, somewhat. What's the word? I don't know. snooty, maybe. I'm not sure if that's right, but that was the idea, that there was this class of listener which existed, that was interested in very, very refined and you know what I mean, right? Keith Jarrett playing Bach is a wonderful example of that, because, you've got a very sophisticated jazz guy and you've got Bach, and you put them together, and, the results were interesting. And we may not have liked it always, but it was interesting. Arvo Pärt was, spiritual. Gia Cancelli was also part of that movement. And all the records had this sort of vanilla look. They're like plain white covers with tiny little wording. Sometimes they were a little bit more colorful than that. And now, of course, ECM has gotten into the period instrument stuff with Andras Schiff and, other artists who were jettisoned by the major labels and were looking to continue making records in whatever, new incarnation they had allotted to themselves. So ECM is another specialty label, and it's one that survived the transition to compact disc very well. It's an independent label and a specialty label. So there you have it. Actually, ECM was always, I remember when I was starting to, do criticism, ECM always had its own PR people. They worked in conjunction because they had distribution through Universal. So they worked out of the offices in New York of Universal, but they were independent. And they were, we had to deal with their special PR person. And boy, did they have attitude. Talk about attitude. Oh, my goodness. But these are, without question, I think, the 5 greatest specialty record labels, the labels that grew up alongside the majors when they were at their most major. Really and successfully did so. And now that the majors are less major, they were either sucked up by the majors, or they ceased to exist, or they were incorporated into something else, or a couple of them, like ECM, have managed to survive basically on their own. So there you have it, my friends. A special category, really. But the transition between the old model and the new for the classical record industry. So keep on listening, friends. Thanks for joining me. Take care.